Hello, everyone. This is the Generation Report. My name is Paul, and I have with me a guest, Heidi Briones. Welcome.
Hi, happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Paul.
Great. Heidi and I connected, I think it was about 2 or 3 weeks ago, with regards
Yeah,
to a an essay that you published on your Substack, which I believe is called Life and Liberty. Is that correct?
yeah, it's the name of my Substack,
And
at
the
least for now.
um,
Yeah.
and the name of the essay was um, "The Fourth Turning is Upon Us. What Now?" Uh, Not much more to say there. Uh, Before we sort of launch into what I hope will be a great conversation, I'll turn it over to you, Heidi, to introduce yourself.
Sure. My name's Heidi Briones. I live in Portland, Oregon. I ran for office in 2020 as a Democrat, and sort of gained a platform through there. And then since then, I've sort of left the party due to a lot of factors going on, and experiencing this crisis moment that we're in Portland, and in the whole world, has sort of led me down this path of trying to understand where we're at, how did we get here, and where can we go from here. So yeah, I am interested in lots of different topics, including liberty, women's rights, and then also this generational theory, which is one of my more niche fringe topics. But I was able to connect with Paul after he read my article. The reason I'm interested is some of the things that I mentioned, but also I find it very odd that people use these terms so casually, like boomer and millennial and and Gen Z and all these terms that do come from generational theory, but they have are almost completely ignorant as to that there is a theory, what this means, what the actual time periods mean, where we're at historically, like how accurate this theory has been, and all of these different things. So I wanted to create a primer, just a very basic kind of summary on what the theory means, what these different generations mean, and where we're at now, and how that affects where we're going. So I'm excited to just chat about it and see if we can come to some sort of an understanding on our historical moment, and where we're at.
Great. Yeah, that's tremendous. Yeah, one of the things that I've noticed for a long time, I've been producing this podcast for about 4.5 years now, but my digging very deep into this goes back a long, long way. It goes back, I think, about 9 years. And everybody who's got a deep interest in this has a story of how they came across it, because it's usually never something that we expect to find and to become grabbed by. What was your story of coming across the idea or the names or one of the books and going, I want to find out more about this?
Good question. I'm not sure if there was one exact moment. I do know it was recently, within the last few years. I think I had heard of this theory just very casually, but really, yeah, during this last few years, because when I'm thinking about why is everyone acting the way they're acting in my generation and the generations after me, and how can I understand that? One, as like having some sort of a platform and being a public figure, and Google says I'm a politician, but don't tell anybody. So wanting to kind of understand how to communicate with people and where their frame of reference was, and so always been interested in psychology, but this is another sort of part of, I think, human psychology and human existence that's not often talked about in detail, but it's alluded to constantly, like, oh, get off my lawn, or these kids these days, or oh, you're a boomer. And like we use these phrases so much without knowing what they mean. And I think it was just the last couple of years I not sure what exactly triggered it, but then I just looked it up and I was just reading, just very basic stuff about the theory. And I was like, I got to get this book and, see about this, because my, you know, instinct in my head was always that 9/11 was a turning point moment for my generation. And if you were a certain age when 9/11 happened, like enough to be aware of it and cognizant, but not quite like firm in your adulthood yet, so that real coming of age time period, which I was 18. And anybody that was around that age, I think like 18 to 22, zone, really, had a certain feeling about that and how it changed their perspective and how the Patriot Acts influenced things and how it just seemed like everything really just shifted from the dream of the 90s to maybe the nightmare of the 2000s like started to emerge. And so I really just yeah really just came across it. I think it was honestly it was probably somebody mentioning something like Zennial or one of those articles and me being like, what does this mean? And just kind of digging into it. But now that I have that framework, I think it's extremely useful. It's been very useful in my conversations and kind of it's not just about, like our personalities or our, Myers-Briggs or, our astrology sign. There's so many different things going on, and I just want to understand people more. And so I dug into it there. So I wouldn't say there's exactly one moment, but what made me want to write the article is one moment. It was I think it was Candace Owens's tweet, which I put in the article,
Yeah.
where she's like talking about if we have a midlife crisis or not, or I forget exactly how she put it, but I was like, well, millennials are always in a crisis. I mean, like we've been in a crisis our entire adulthood, and people are like, rah, rah, rah. And I'm like, no, literally, we've been in a crisis our entire, like, I'm not like, it's not really an opinion. Like, it's just like, that's the period of time that we're in. Like, I'm not trying to be like, millennials are bad, boomers are good, da, da, da. None of that even matters. Like, it's just, these are the facts of what's actually going on that's historically proven, and we can go back and see the patterns. And I think that that's something that's important and can give us that perspective.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I was 16. I was 16 on
Oh,
nine
okay.
11, and I can definitely attest that as soon as that happened, the 1990s became viewed in a different light and became viewed in a nostalgic light. I don't know if the nostalgia still persists in the way that perhaps it once did, especially for us. I think specifically of a movie like Independence Day, which I was just thinking about again recently because it was the 4th of
Yeah,
July,
the
and I
Fourth
was
of
like,
July.
this movie seems so long ago. I can't even process it now. But that was our youth, and it is
Yeah.
it has dissipated like everybody's youth does. For those who may not be aware, and I imagine that most people, if they're still listening, they are. The book we're discussing, or the theory that's attached to a book we're discussing, is The Fourth Turning by William Strauss and Neil Howe. It was published in 1997. And Neil Howe, who is the living co-author of The Fourth Turning, William Strauss has since passed away. Neil Howe, excuse me, is coming out with the long, long awaited sequel to The Fourth Turning next week. In fact, I think it's probably going off the publishing presses right now, and it's just going to hit Amazon and people's front doorsteps next Tuesday. What eventually came to move me, among many reasons, to want to engage in this conversation was I began to see that even though the interest in the subject was growing and the theory that forms the basis of Strauss and Howe's work, a lot of the context and the a lot of the basis for what their work was about in the first place was starting to really get lost. And amid things like just a lot of mentions on Tim Pool's program. And I enjoy Tim Pool's program, but a lot of his guests who have mentioned the fourth turning, I've found their explanations to more or less all be the same. And in addition, there was an off Broadway play, as many listeners may know, that was loosely based on the book and its ideas that came out, I believe, in 2019, which I've seen. And it's a good play. But I could also tell right away, and I mean instantly, that the person who wrote the play, Will Arbery, did not believe in the theory because he just gave the standard issue cookie cutter talking points and ran through them right in a row through the character who was reading the dialogue, and it was just, oh, this is somebody who doesn't believe in this, which is fine, to each their own. But as you were saying, I know that we can both, I think, at this point, given our status as not just millennials, but on the older end of the millennial side, and seeing what we've seen among people our age and people a bit younger than us, that something like what Strauss and I predicted is happening People need to know
Yeah.
about it, and people our age need to know about it more than anything else.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that since we're coming up into, that third phase, of our development, so we're not children and we're not young adults, and I'm coming up, I think, in generations at least they talk about it being around 42 or 43, when you kind of move into that phase of your life where you're the leaders of institutions, and you're really running things. Since we are in our generation are coming into that time, and we are the civic generation, that means that we're going to take some control and some power over things. And so I'm very interested to see how that plays out, especially with everything that's going on, and that we're eventually going to have this some kind of secular event, some kind of events coming up here. And how is that going to play out? How are we going to respond to that event? Is it going to be a war? Is it going to be depression? Is it what is actually going to happen? And is it going to be, are we going to move into optimism like we typically have? But we could go a different direction too. There could be like a reactive response, and there's so many different things coming up here that things have changed so rapidly since the last time this happened, that I'm like, okay, as a millennial who's coming up and who's supposed to be in charge, theoretically of, a lot of institutions are coming up, into that power of being from 40 to retirement is when we're typically out there the most. What does that mean? And, what does that say about our generation, and how are we going to respond to that when it comes up? So I think it's very, very important for especially millennials, that are coming into this next phase of our life to understand what that means and the significance of what's going to happen, when this happens, because I believe it will happen in the next few years. There's going to be this, they call it a secular event, or a massive event, or the peak crisis or a war or whatever we want to call it. Something's going to happen, and how are we going to respond to that, and what does that mean, and where what are we going to do about that?
Yeah, a lot is riding on us, and that actually pivots really nicely to something that I've noticed quite a bit, which is the people who summarize these ideas overwhelmingly are older, which means they do not have the millennials' point of view of not only the all the crises that you mentioned, but also just there's all these nuances that come with not just being a member of a generation, but being a human being, where no matter how much you might get right in describing a person or describing a group of people or describing a generation in anecdotes that may fit the people and fit their experience, it's never the sum total of the whole thing. My parents are boomers. Most of my older relatives are boomers. I don't know what growing up in their era was like. Most of my older cousins are Xers. I don't know what growing up in their era is like and how that shaped them. The same is true of millennials, and no matter how to almost a fine-tooth comb the experts out there might get us right, and if they don't abide by Strauss and Howe, they mostly don't. That's also important to say. Is we understand that our growing up experience and our coming of age experience was similar to previous generations in American history, but it was just different enough that our perspective and our contributions and our place in everything that's taking place now needs to be understood on its own terms for what's happening in the present more than what's happened in the past. And if you'd like, I can go into at some point establishing what the basis for this whole theory really is, or even just how Strauss and Howe started collaborating for those who maybe.
Yeah, please. I mean, I don't know that much about it. I mean, I do know that they were, I guess sort of academics, but then they're also in marketing as well. So yeah, I'd love to hear more about that. I have not that much knowledge about them as people and sort of how that, came to be. So yeah.
So basically, William Strauss and Neil Howe were DC policy wonks, policy analysts, highly credentialed Ivy League um, young movers and shakers in Washington in the late 80s. William Strauss, I believe, had more of a footprint actually working inside government for a time. and Neil Howe was working with people who were involved in entitlements reform or lobbying with politicians uh, to prepare like research on entitlements reform and what needed to be done in that area. And so through this mutual space they were in and just knowing a lot of the same people and having similar kinds of backgrounds, they eventually when they met each other, they realized they'd also at this point become published authors, and both of their published books in both cases had the common thread was generational issues and generational identities. So ultimately they decided to collaborate together, and that led to them getting, I believe, a stipend of some sort to spend several years working on a book that was essentially something that nobody had ever done before, which was write a work that would essentially be a biography of every American generation going back to the Puritans, the first English colonial settlers in the 17th century. In the course of doing that research, their word is from the very beginning, all they wanted to do was just dig into all the firsthand and secondhand resources on each group of people, give the best portrait they could give for each group, and just proceed along until the end. But what they discovered in the course of this project, again, this was more than 30 years ago, was that approximately every 80 to 100 years, certain characteristic personality types, generation to generation, started reappearing, recurring, as well as big events, big social trends in the outer world and the two cycles seem to correspond together. On that basis, they put forward the hypothesis for the first time in this book, which is called Generations, the History of America's Future, that there is a basic relationship between social and historical change and generational differences and generational change that moves history or has moved American history in a certain way. Fast forward a few years, a lot of their predictions from that book started coming true. That's what led them to decide to write their most famous book, The Fourth Turning, which, rather than focusing strictly on generational biographies and incorporating it into history, was more about history and the cycles that go with it and incorporating the generational biographies into the American story.
Yeah, that's so crazy. I mean, we all kind of know this, people say cliches like history repeats itself and, things like that. But I mean, no, it really truly does. And I think that you learn the most, at least I do, by reading older books. I actually prefer the older the book, the better, because it's very interesting to me how you see the same patterns, emerging throughout time. So that's wild. I mean, because to think that and I mean, I don't know if you have perspective on like globally, but just assuming like it's just the US that goes through these patterns, to understand like and go through the history and then see, this exact pattern forming with, about 80 some years, these exact same things are happening. Yeah, you could become a Nostradamus or like, someone that could predict the future, or you could seem psychic because being psychic or these like abilities like can be seen as just pattern recognition. You're just so much better at pattern recognition than other people are, right? So like you walk into a room, you get a bad vibe, you're like, I'm out. Okay, well, you're just seeing patterns. Like you're just see patterns better than other people do. You walk in and you're like, I don't like the way that person's looking, or I don't like, this thing here, this looks unsafe, or I'm just gonna, exit. And people could say you're so psychic or whatever, because then later on this happened. And it's like, well, maybe I'm just paying attention to what's happened before more than everybody else, right? So yeah, that's kind of how I see them as being these, yeah, I mean, accidental, psychics or accidental Nostradamus in a way, just like their predictions are so scarily accurate. I mean, I started my article with, the prediction that they made about the year, I think 2005, and there's another one that they make around this year, 2025. There's just so much eerily, creepy quotes in both generations, and more so Fourth Turning,
Yep.
that we've come to see past. So yeah, it's super fascinating, and I think that that's That's really what historians, do seek to do. I think a lot is really they're trying to understand, where we are, as people and, recognize these patterns and what does this mean, and like, how can we avoid, things in the future sometimes are thinking that way. But they're almost like, okay, well, we can't avoid it in a way. Like you can't avoid like certain things, but you can be aware. And how does that awareness influence, these patterns? That's also interesting to me too. I mean, if we're more aware of these patterns happening, does that have any influence on how we respond to them?
Yeah.
Or does it not matter because just a small percentage of people will even have that awareness
Yeah.
anyway? But yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Nostradamus because that invariably, if they or their work are profiled in the New York Times, the Washington Post, um, anywhere in the usual suspects in the mainstream media, that word, that label will appear.
Hmm.
It really is something that you can almost bet a house on. And in fact, it appeared again. It appeared again in the New York Times story that was published, I believe, on Saturday about the book, which is the beginning of what I think will be a short but very intense attention span to the book by the mainstream media. I think that once Neil is on the interview circuit about it, I
What's the
think
name of
that
the book?
it's the fourth turning is here.
Oh,
Is
wow.
the name of
Okay.
it. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, cool.
So I think the most important thing to establish about Strauss and Howe's work is that the absolute fundamental core basis of their entire set of ideas is that everything in nature, everything in the world that's a living organism has something in common. They all have a life cycle. And that life cycle proceeds, if it's lived out in full, the same way for every living thing. Every living thing is born, it grows, it matures, it declines, and it passes away. That fundamental principle, that fundamental framework of how everything that if every life cycle, if lived out in full, proceeds that way, is what makes for the four seasons of the year. If you think about it, spring is the birth to growth season, summer is the growth to maturation season, autumn is the maturation to decline season, and winter is the decline to death season. You have this process of four seasons occurring in nature. And since every living thing goes through those same phases, if lived out in full, those living things also have essentially four life phases, which means that human beings also fundamentally have four life phases, which moving to entire generations of people means that generations of people have four life phases too. And this process has a parallel in the way history moves, which is that the changes over every 80 to 100 year span reflect, in the fundamental sense, the rhythms in nature and the rhythms in the human life cycle. So, how this applies to America is as follows. World War II ended in 1945. Since then, we have been through four turnings. The first turning of the current historical epic that we're living through, which by their terminology is what they call a high, began with demobilization after World War II and ran until the assassination of President Kennedy. During eras like this, public support for strong institutions is high, conformity in the culture is also high. There tends to be a great sense that children are to be indulged. A lot of children are born during these kinds of eras. Opportunities for personal, conventional advancement also tend to be high. Civic progress is generally very strong during these periods. Inward fulfillment takes a hit. And people who feel themselves outside the mainstream are shut out because of the emphasis on conformity that pervades most everybody's daily life. Following highs, which are first turnings, is what's called a second turning or an awakening. Awakenings are eras when suddenly people don't want to live by social obligations anymore. They want to rediscover themselves. There are huge new currents for cultural and spiritual discovery and creativity, and also challenging a political and economic and social structure which seems to be unresponsive to the new cultural currents coming up from below. The second turning in America, Strauss and Howe argue, lasted from about 1964 to about 1983. And during that era, in comparison with the high, children were underprotected. The cultural creativity and sense of dynamism was huge. The whole society moves toward away from institutional solidarity and toward inward fulfillment and throwing off social obligations. Second turnings are followed by third turnings, which are called unravelings. Unravelings are eras when the individuation that's set in motion by the awakening goes to a totally new place. There's a lot of speculation in the economy, a lot of free money tends to float around. Personal fulfillment, or at least opportunities for it, tend to be very high. But there's also a sense that social dysfunctions have started to get out of control. And so children start to be reprotected. But the most important thing, maybe of all, about third turnings is that during these eras, public problems are deferred because the individuation of these eras just means that it's put to the side. But this leads into fourth turnings, which is the last phase of the cycle, which is a crisis, which is where we are now, which America and much of the world have been in since 2008. These are the eras when political, social, economic systems are totally reconstructed and reconstituted and rebuilt in response to the feeling, completely unlike the prior two turnings for sure, that suddenly social obligation matters, social cohesion matters, political decisions that carry a lot of consequences have to be made. And this leads whole societies, not just America, but modern societies as a general rule, toward a sense of public crisis, a sense that politicians are making choices that have a very direct impact on people's lives for good or ill or in between. And children receive a crazy amount of protection to the point of smothering.
Yeah, so we're both millennials. Obviously, we're, grew up in the unraveling. Were your parents like Gen X, like, or were
Oh, my parents are boomers.
your parents are boomers? Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
I think I heard Neil Howe say a few some years ago that the tipping point when millennials, excuse me, when the dominant parent generation for millennials went from boomers to Xers was for people born around 1990, 91.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sure. I mean, my parents had me pretty young, so they're technically Gen X. They're kind of on the cusp,
Yep.
as well. They're 62 and 63. So depending on where you
Mm.
define that, but it's pretty much on the cusp. Anyway, slice it. And then I was 83. So I'm pretty much right there, at the turn. But then I was raised by the silent generation. So then that's even weirder. The silent generation, it was my grandparents, they raised my uh Gen X, yeah, father and uncles. And then I was millennial. And so yeah, it's you can tell though, the differences between I have, friends that were raised by boomers. I didn't really have like some of my uncles and aunts were boomers and stuff, but I didn't really have a lot of that boomer mentality so much. Like I had the silent generation more just like kind of, I don't know, just how would you say, laissez-faire or kind of leave it alone, almost attitude in a way, but still traditional, obviously, just because they're older. And then I had very individualistic parents who so individualistic they left me with my grandparents, to do whatever they wanted to do. And I didn't really have like that like super optimism boomer thing. I did have like the individual aspect, like you can do what you want to do in a way, like live your life the way you want to live it. But the boomer influence wasn't in my direct life. So that's kind of separates me a little bit more from other millennials, which kind of have this tension, I think. With the boomers, I don't really have that so much. And I consider myself like almost more Gen X just because of being on the cusp, and kind of being more individualistic. And just those are the people I looked up to at that age. They were slightly older than me. They were like the rebels and like the cool kids, and all the pop culture. The movies and the music from that time is so it's just like so Gen X. It's just so like definitive of that time, like all the music of the 90s that was made by, the Nirvana and, all this type of music that was very kind of coming to terms with who you are, I think, is what influenced like the elder millennials, which is completely different from the younger millennials, which had a different experience. And, were only maybe 10 or something when 9/11 happened and, maybe couldn't really fully grasp the change there. So yeah, there's definitely like the dominance, the dominant part of these generations, and how does that influence, and also like who raised you? What generation raised you, and what attitudes did they put upon you about what's going on, as well?
Yeah. The trend that I've noticed among people who seem to be about 25 and under now is wearing Nirvana shirts as like a
Ironic way
yeah,
almost, or like
an ironic fashion statement, but also like it makes
nostalgic,
them
or like
cool, but in a way that was different from the way people wore them when we were growing up. It's really strange to see. It's sort of
yeah.
like
Well, it's almost like the hippie style or something to them. It's like this, oh, tie-dye shirt or something in the 90s,
yep,
You're
yep,
like it's like, like it's
yep,
like a homage to like this other generation that was like cool and like rebellious in some way, or like, like I mean, it's counterculture at that time, but it was kind of mainstream culture, I think in the 90s to be almost counterculture, to be the rebel. That almost became like the mainstream, whereas opposed to like 60s, it was actually like mostly people were very optimistic and like, just like, yeah, gung ho for, everything. But then you have this very strong counterculture, which happens during those times where you have, the people that feel like you mentioned left out of that kind of positivity. So that's sort of like what we'd be coming into, in the first turning, which is when we're going to be getting older here. And I think we're going to see that. We're going to see, people that are, maybe more conservative, for lack of a better word, or they're just, kind of gung ho about the high. But then we're going to, I think, see, a strong counterculture as well. People that feel very left out by that kind of concept and feel like they're not a part of it, and they form
yep,
other tribes.
yep. And what I think is I agree with all that. And what I think is worth pointing out um, for people who may know but may not remember is that Strauss and Howe give distinctly different um, birth year spans for each generation of people
Yeah.
than the Census Bureau and the Pew Research Center and all the clickbait media sites and the mainstream media. Strauss and Howe are very specific that since the middle of World War II, there's only been four generations born in America, not five, not six, just four. And the Gen Z label may stick around. In fact, I think at this point, it's probably a good chance that it will, just because it's been here long enough. It's attributed to the wrong group of people. People who are today of voting age or who reached voting age last year for the midterms when everybody was talking about Gen Z, everybody born from 1982 through 2004 who was voting age for the first time last year, all those people are millennials. And maybe just briefly, I'll explain why. I mentioned the four turnings before. Boomers were the children of the first turning. They were the children of the spring of history between the demobilization after World War II and the assassination of President Kennedy. And for reasons that I won't get into here, but there's a little bit of a lead where the birth years of each generation lead the era spans by a few years. For that reason, they place boomers, Strauss and Howe do, at 1943 to 1960, not 1946 to 1964. Generations are not defined by their demographic birth bulges. They're defined by common experience, common personalities, and common contributions to the world. And when you look at people born 1943, 44, 45, you can see that they're boomers. Same thing with Generation X. They have Generation X as the children of the second turning. Gen Xers were born 1961 to 81, not 65 to 80. Moving to millennials, millennials started in 1982, and there's a series of very good reasons for that. Basically, at the end of the second turning in the very early 1980s, there were a lot of stories going around about how the sort of unfettered freedoms of the 1960s and 70s had worked their way into kids not just being the victims of too many parental divorces, but kids were being woefully underprotected or unprotected. The most famous case of which was the Adam Walsh murder in the summer of 1981. We're born afterwards, so we don't remember that time, but I know a lot of Xers who were young then remember that event and remember how, even if they didn't personally experience the rush to protective parenting that millennial kids would later, they remember how scary that was and what the reaction of the country was when, for those who don't know, Adam Walsh was the 6-year-old son of John Walsh from America's Most Wanted. Disappeared. He was found abducted and brutally murdered in Florida. And suddenly, stories about how we'd done wrong by kids ever since the mid 1960s were everywhere. And it's not a coincidence that the very next year, the baby on board bumper stickers appeared and all kinds of things started appearing in what was available to buy in stores. The whole economy, the whole political conversation in America started reorienting to protecting kids and giving them standards to meet in school to make them high achieving. All these things that profoundly changed the way kids were raised, the way kids were educated. The tipping point is 1982. And if you actually look at a list or compare a list of people born 1980 and 81 versus people born 1982 and later, you see that difference. You see the difference, particularly in those born in 80 and 81, had a much greater pop culture footprint, especially when you and I were growing up, Heidi. It was the Beyoncés, the Justin Timberlakes, the Britney Spears, the Christina Aguileras, um, Paris
Is that
Hilton,
really when they were
Kim
born?
Kardashian, Macaulay
Really?
Culkin. All these people were born in 1980 and 81.
Yeah, 81. Okay.
And when you move to the later period, you start to get people like Mark Zuckerberg, people like Ben Shapiro, people like Ibram Kendi. Uh, nearly all the American Idol winners were born from 1982 onward. And I think the short explanation I would give there is that American Idol was a contest dynamic in which essentially people were lobbying to the powers that be in a conventional way to get their big opportunity. And that was really not something that a lot of Xers were doing in the same way when they were our age. But when American Idol became a factor and a lot of these other talent shows became a factor, I do not see it as a coincidence that you started to see overwhelmingly millennials populating the contestants, populating the people who made a real shot at winning and people who won, because their whole mindset was different. The
Mm.
mindset was, again, appealing to the powers that be, being conventional and showing who you are and getting opportunities. Whereas Xers had from what I can tell, a little bit more of a pragmatic sense of, well, you're just kind of in it on your own and you're going to stake out at a young age to try to get into the entertainment world. And a lot of those people who I mentioned before, the Beyoncés, the Timberlakes, and Spearses, they got into the entertainment industry young.
Oh
And
yeah.
this is one of just many, many anecdotal ways that you can see that the people who say that millennials were born 81 to 96 are wrong. They're just wrong. Millennials started in 82 and ran to 2004 because that's what gives them a common
Hmm.
birth location in the third turning of history that Strauss and Howe described. And the
Yeah.
generation after millennials started in 2005 because those are the last kids who have no recollection of a time before 2008, which is the event that touched off the fourth turning. So every generation is about 20 years long.
Mm. Okay. So where does this come from then? That Gen Alpha is like already a thing then.
The Gen Alpha phenomenon, the short answer is that it is a rush to label new people in
Mm.
response to events, in response to stories about one group or another just getting
Right. Like people
exhausted.
don't want their kids to be Gen Z kind of thing.
Exactly.
They're like, my kid's not Gen Z. They're something
Right.
else. Yeah.
Right.
Like,
And so for anybody listening out there who is between about 19, 18 or 19 and about 26, if you're born between 1997 and 2004, congratulations, you're not a Zer, you're not a Zoomer, you're a millennial. Uh,
I think
based upon the
they call themselves like, do they call themselves Zennials too with a Z? Like I've seen like all kinds of stuff like with like
what's
or
interesting
like
about the cusp, what's interesting about the cusp, and you mentioned it before, and I believe that discussing cusps is important too, because I'm the same way with you. There are times when the millennial label gets applied to me, and I wish it didn't. Not because I don't know I'm a millennial. I've known that most of my life before I got into this
you 82?
subject. 85.
Oh, that's right. Sorry, 85. Okay.
Um, but
So you're definitely a millennial. I mean, at 85. I mean,
but I had it was interesting. I had enough contact with older kids when I was growing up,
yeah.
enough situations where I knew dead certain that I was different from them and they were different from me.
Hmm.
At the same time, especially as I got a little bit older, I realized that a lot of my references to just popular culture and music and just a sensibility about how to live your daily life and abide by your own thoughts when you need to and not move with the group, that is a tendency that, in my experience, recedes dramatically for millennials just a little bit younger than me.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think yeah, when you think about what makes you cool, you kind of feel more Gen X, right? When you think about what makes you kind of dorky, then you're like I'm a millennial. Like dang it,
Absolutely.
Like
Absolutely.
cuz
Yeah.
like and I think like the internet really is like a turning point too. I mean, like because I think I was 10 around 10 when I started like going on AOL and stuff like that and learning about the internet and like having this new kind of thing, but you got to think, I mean, Gen X is a lot older than that's not maybe something not for all of them. Like a lot of them were like deep into raising families or doing other things. It wasn't such an exciting kind of like moment in the same way. They didn't like get into the social media at this young kind of fragile mindset of being an adolescent and prepubescent and then teenage years, learning about, the internet and connecting with people, strangers and all this stuff, stranger danger. And like
Yeah.
the latchkey kids kind of went, by the wayside. That was a big thing with Gen X. Like a lot of them were latchkey kids and that started to like, fade out for reasons that you mentioned, wanting to protect kids and otherwise. And I think yeah, I think that the experience that people have had with the internet is like is one for me. It's like, how old were you? If you were born and somebody handed you an iPad, then we had a different experience, to me. But but we still, I still do agree though. If you before the fourth turning, obviously if you were born before the fourth turning, then that's the same generation,
Yeah.
because we're just the way it works. But of course, when a generation is 20 something years long, you're going to have variation. You're going to have people at one end of it and the other end of it. Your
Right.
people have starting at the start of an unraveling, at the end of an unraveling, and at the start of a crisis.
Yeah. And by the way, I should add also that there are a lot of people who, and I've noticed this in particular for people born in 1981, that because they've been told their whole lives they're millennials, there's a certain number of them who will hold to that and say, no, 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 I'm really a millennial. I grew up with safer playgrounds, and I had just a different relationship with my parents than a lot of you know peers who I knew who are a bit older than me, and and I grant all of that, and I think what's important to take away from that is that it's not as though 82 through 2004, to use the millennial boundaries, which were pretty much exactly the boundaries Strauss and Howe predicted in 1990, by the way.
Yeah.
They were
Yeah.
looking at what was going on with little kids at that time and projecting the future based upon this idea that would become the fourth turning, and said, okay, these kids started in '82 and they're going to probably be born for about another 20 years. So they made that prediction a long time ago. But what I think is really important to emphasize is that people can be on the cusp with a neighboring generation and feel like they're more part of the cultural, social, or
Hmm.
just general life sensibility of people just younger or just older than them. That's not uncommon, and it needs to
No.
be acknowledged and recognized that
Yeah.
those people do exist, and their point of view has a legitimacy to
Yeah.
it. But
Of course. Yeah.
for historical purposes, the group
Hmm.
they're moving with, and it's not just because Strauss and Howe say this, but they make a very detailed argument about why these birth year boundaries are just the way they are. For historical purposes, people born in '81 are Xers,
Yeah.
and as you know, as I said before, there's just
Yeah.
lots of examples
Oh,
in popular culture and elsewhere where
yeah.
that prove that.
No, definitely. I mean, like for me, thinking, okay, like people born 81 are Xers. Okay, well, who did I think was cool, when I'm growing up? I mean, people a couple years older than me, you're looking at like people at your school and, you're thinking, oh, those are the cool, like, eighth graders or whatever. Like, what are they doing? And that's something that somebody born in the middle of, one of these periods doesn't really have. You don't have that like immediate like connection like socially to people in a different generation, to where you feel like you deeply know them and kind of know their experience of life because you were there watching it even though it's not yours exactly, but you were viewing it. But if you're born in 1991 or something, I mean pretty much everyone in your peer group is just solidly like experiencing the same thing. I think that's something to keep in mind. And then also like what generation raised you, as well, has to be like taken into account because they're gonna impart different attitudes on what's happening currently than a different generation.
And I would I agree with all that, and I would add too that if I were to put a bracket on the where the millennial cusp with Gen X stops, exennial if you want to use that word,
Yeah, yeah.
it's '82 through '86.
Hmm.
Because '86, I went to school mostly. Most of
Right,
my
because you're like
friends,
5, 6, like when you go to school. Yeah.
right, most of my friends who I grew up with back home were born in '85, but most of the people I went to school with, especially in college, were born in '86.
Hmm.
You're born in '86, by and large, you graduated from college in 2008. Now, many millennials did not go to college or went to a 2 year program or otherwise got into the uh, pre-Great Recession economy before 2008. So I'm not dismissing them, but at any rate, the people born '86 and earlier who are millennials hit the real world before September 2008 when everything crashed. And I
Yeah,
was just out of college at the
I
time.
was
I
right
graduated in
there.
2008,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it was like a tidal wave.
Oh
I
yeah,
never
I
saw
graduated in 2007. Yeah. Yeah.
what I really remember from my last semester in college was just little signs that things were changing. And I had a roommate who I think was a big, well, maybe not a big reader, Matt Drudge, but he would read it occasionally. And stories about what was happening in the economy would, be getting more. At least the headlines would be bigger on the Drudge Report
Yeah.
than other places. And you started to get the feeling that things were starting to get really different, and we were just about to graduate. And I
Yeah.
can't attest that I ever had the sort of pit in my stomach feeling about it all. But within a few months, my life changed. And that is one of the many reasons that when I did find these ideas, they grabbed me immediately because it was like,
Yeah.
oh, I lived this. I
Oh yeah.
graduated the year the world came.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, I graduated 2007 and then I saw things kind of turning. I remember some whisperings of, economic crisis, like, and, some mortgage stuff. Like, I just remember, like, kind of hearing about it and it just did not seem good. And job prospects were not good. And I actually left the country and I went to teach English in Taiwan during that period. So I spent a year and a half avoiding it, like
Yeah.
completely avoiding it and just hearing about it and being like, that sounds terrible. I'll stay a little bit longer, and traveled a bit. And then, yeah, I came back about a year and a half later. So that must have been, I don't know, almost 2009. Yeah, once like some of the dust, I guess, had sort of settled from no, but it was still bad. It was still like, still a lot of economic like turmoil and all that. And I just felt like, yeah, I wanted to avoid it, I guess. And I mean, being in another country, especially like Taiwan as an English teacher during that time, I really felt like I totally like missed it,
Mm,
in a lot of ways. I mean, I was having a great time and I wasn't worried about it. And I was like, I'm just going to delay adulthood like many millennials have because, well, it's not a good time like to be an adult.
yeah,
Like I can't buy a house, I can't do all this stuff, so I'm just going to delay it, which then inherently delays, childbirth if that's something you want. I'm not going to do that, but if that's something you want, that delays it for people, and it delays buying a home, which I still don't have a home. I don't know if I ever will, I don't know if that's something I want anymore. But it's just all these decisions that you're supposed to do, you didn't do because of this time period that you're in, which makes total sense historically. And if like culturally, people will blame millennials and say, well, you just need to, whatever, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And it's like, well, anybody during this phase of life, during this historical time period would want to delay, that period a bit because it's not a great time
yeah,
to be coming of age and making those decisions.
yeah. I definitely think that applications to teach abroad programs, applications to graduate school, and maybe as much as anything else, applications or payments to testing help programs like Princeton Review,
Mm,
booming after
right.
2008.
Okay, we'll
And
just
I
go
can
back to
attest,
school. We'll just do this. We'll do Peace Corps. We'll do we'll
yeah,
do something else because like this is not a good time to start a career, like apparently. And we're still suffering, the consequences of that. I mean, yeah, it's we're just delaying it still.
absolutely. And for those who may doubt that what Heidi and I are saying is legitimate, there's a book I want to plug now. It is not by Strauss and Howe, but it's called The Theft of a Decade. The book came out 5 years ago. It's by Joseph C. Sternberg, and a lot of the things, without getting into specifics, a lot of the things that Joseph C. Sternberg, who is a millennial himself, talks about in that book, I personally experienced.
Yeah,
And I know I'm not the
same.
only one.
Yeah, same. But I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, like I agree the way he's saying the subtext here is could be offensive to certain groups. But I think that if you look historically, that kind of has to happen, right? Because the economic decisions made by that generation that were made in a high are going to affect people, in the fourth turning that are coming of age, right? I mean, like
Yep.
that's just sort of how it is. So I don't think people should be offended by these things. It's sort of like part of the reason why I wanted to get into this because I don't think it's productive to be, pitting generations against each other. I mean, it's going to happen naturally. There's always going to be some of that and blame in this, but I think the perspective that this provides is like, oh, okay, so like, yes, whatever. Baby boomers obviously had an effect on the economy, but like the last the last baby boom also did, and like the last one and the last because it's just like that's how it is. So it's nothing, against that group of people, and it's nothing like, you're this or you're that. And I think that that's important because, we do need to come together at some point if we're coming into, if we're in the fourth turning essentially. And, since we're in the fourth turning, we're getting very tribal. We've been in a crisis for a long time. How does this perspective kind of offer us some semblance of, hope or some semblance of how are we forming these tribes? What are my tribes? Like, do I want to divide myself by generation? Does that make sense? Like, maybe it does in some ways, but maybe I do need, certain people from other generations in my tribe, for different reasons, and maybe that's important to understand. Like how this was formed, and just yeah, just I don't know, give each other a break because we've all been going through a pretty rough time. Even if you're older, it's not like boomers didn't get wiped out in many different ways during this economic crisis. A lot of them lost homes and otherwise because that's where they were in their life. Not nobody came out unscathed. So I think offering that perspective, I think, can be positive if we spin it the right way. But of course, they want to sell books. People are
Yep.
gonna people are gonna say things and sensationalize things. In articles on this topic, like you mentioned, books, little clips or whatever, or just tweets, they're going to sensationalize generational theory. But
Yep.
I think if you just look even just slightly deeper, it offers a ton of perspective.
So one thing I think would be good to do now is
Yeah.
I know you want to talk about Generation Z and how they're similar to the silent. Something that we've only, I think, just briefly touched on so far is how throughout these cycles of history that occur, four turnings per cycle, the cycles last every 80 to 100 years. There are four generations born during each one of these long eras, and they each have an archetype.
Mm-hmm.
So I
Yep.
know that you wanted to talk about Generation Z, or who are being the people who are being called Generation Z today's kids, uh, and uh, and the silent generation who are older than boomers, but many of them are still alive. Many of them are still in politics.
Well, yeah, they're
Um,
mostly in politics. Yeah.
Many people have commented on the similarities between them, and I know you wanted to expand on.
Knowing that they're 18 at the oldest, that's kind of interesting to me because, I mean, I feel like there's an influence of Gen Z on the silent generation, and obviously, the other way too, being that they are a lot of our political leaders. But I also think that the young generation is having an odd influence on culture, um, based on where we're at, based on like kind of a vacuum, for like what moment are we in? And you see this with like, gender ideology, you see this with culture. A lot of kids are absorbed in that. So yeah, I just think that that's interesting to compare because when I think of my grandparents, they actually relate most, I think, to my younger um, siblings or cousins or anything, and they kind of have like a more relation to them, and there's more kind of strife between like me as a millennial versus like them as a silent generation. I think that that's like there's been a lot of clashing there,
Mm.
as far as attitudes, but I think the younger kids are more, I don't know if it's passive or ambivalent, or there's just like a different attitude that fits the silent generation more. So I'm talking about, kids that are like 18, age, like, and younger, a little bit younger too, just kind of relating, I think, to that generation and being like, yeah, they tend to be more, voting for Democrats, that type of a thing, like kind of like more in that realm of like people that are in power currently. And so I'm curious about, yeah, your thoughts on that and like if that even makes sense. Like how they would relate, how generations relate to each other when they do exist at the same time, and
Well,
they're
well, I,
alive.
well, I,
Yeah.
well, I think what's interesting, and a lot of people have said this, is that generations that are 3 and 4 apart, which
Uh-huh.
tends to be how grandparents and grandchildren work, is
Yeah.
that there tends to be at least, not always, but there tends to
Yeah.
be at least a 3 generation gap there. That that does make for fonder relationships in some ways, or warmer
Mhm.
relationships, or there's a
Then the
kind of affection.
parent-child thing. Then
Right,
yeah,
right.
yeah.
Because often, and again, this is by no means universal, but what often
Right, right.
happens is that generations like boomers are
Mhm.
raised by generations like the World War II GI
GI.
generation,
Yeah.
and generations like boomers have a lot of millennial children, and millennial children, or well, we're not, we were children once.
Well, maybe we still are in some ways. Yeah.
Yeah, millennials millennials are archetypally similar for a lot of historical reasons that
Hmm.
stress it out. They give lots of reasons why millennials and the GIs are archetypally similar.
Hmm.
Same is true for the people who are called Gen Z now,
Yeah.
and always that qualifier. People who are called Gen Z and the silent, because I can only speak for myself, but going back to when I was in grade school, for example, and middle school, even before high school, I could see that people around my age moved in groups, moved in cliques, moved in herds at times. Everybody wanted to dress alike. Everybody
Yep.
wanted to have the same kind of cultural interests. Everybody wanted to deal with adults with the same way when they were around adults. And we were often, I was not always the loudest and most boisterous, but as a general rule, even those of us who were not high on the extroversion scale were outwardly, extrinsically confident um,
Yeah.
and ambitious in ways that I think kids who have grown up in the last 10, 15, 20 years have not been in the same way.
No.
And
No.
there are lots of reasons for that, and you can break it down by who their parents are and what era they've grown up in. But the critical point is they're a different generation of people. They're
Yeah.
different today at age 14, 15, 16,
Hmm.
17, or younger than we were at the same age, which means they will be different for life. In the same way we were different from Xers, in the same way Xers were different from Boomers, in the same way that Boomers were different from the silent. The key is the upbringing and the early signs of the personality of kids who are up to age 18 now shows a lot of similarities, and not just in things that people observe in everyday life, but in a lot of polls that are going around about hard data being collected on what these kids
Hmm.
think, and how slowly they're acclimating to the sense that they're growing up,
Yeah.
and they've got this almost so many of them a kind of docile side to them. We were not docile when we were kids.
No, no.
We
I mean, I remember, yeah. I mean, like I said, I grew up with my grandparents, they're silent generation, and they just thought I was the best thing ever. They thought I was like a freaking genius. I'm like, no, I had above average like intelligence, but like I certainly wasn't a genius. But they thought they thought I was a genius and I was so charismatic and everybody would come to see me, and it was just like I was like the greatest thing ever. And like true, I was like the first grandkid. But I think some of it was
was I.
also that. It was also that too, because it's like, they grew up in a very kind of toned down way, like it's just like they're kind of like, okay, we just kind of like we just kind of assimilate and tone down, and we're just like we are who we are and we just go about our days.
Mhm.
But the millennials are very very different, like very boisterous, like justice minded, like always being like that's not right. Like there's a story my grandpa tells me of like me telling the dog like, you better be good because crime doesn't pay, and like all these things that they thought I was like hilarious because I was like saying all these things that were like, it's just like that civic minded thing where you're like constantly like socially aware and like where's my place like here and like where am I fitting in, that they didn't really care about that. They were just like, their mindset was you just do what you're supposed to do. Like there's just you just
Right.
go and do what you're supposed to do. And like even my grandpa to this day has certain habits, like he would just go and play tennis every day, until he physically couldn't anymore. Because it's like that's just what you do. You're like very like I'm a habitual person and I just do the right thing, and that my life works out. And then so yeah, them seeing everything. I mean, when I talk to my grandparents, they just think everything's just horrible now because like all this like individualism rampant, but like also like tribalism and also like division, and people just you know expressing themselves like in these crazy ways to them. They think it's just like horrible and like just like terrible, and they have no idea how to interact with what's going on. A lot of these people just stay at home, these very elderly people, and they don't want to interact anymore.
Yeah.
They think things have just gotten too crazy. But
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So what Heidi and I have been talking about is that the silent generation and the people called Gen Z. I have to.
What do you call it? Homeland, or you don't call it anything yet?
Well, I use the word homeland more because people
Okay,
who
yeah.
are who subscribe to Strauss and Howe's
Hmm.
ideas use
Use
that
homeland.
term.
Yeah.
That term's not going to stick. It was a poll
No.
that they did for their website a long time ago,
No,
and it's
yeah.
got
That was
no traction in the wider culture.
no one knows what that means. Yeah.
It's a useful placeholder. I mean, we were called Generation Y when we were growing up, so
Yeah,
that
that's
that sort of
horrible.
thing has
Yeah.
a we can
But what do you
this
call do you call Gen X, or do you call it 13th?
oh I call them Gen X,
Or you
and
do?
by the
Okay.
way, I don't use
Mm.
I'm sort of
Okay.
pulling back the curtain on some of the liberties I take with this stuff. I do not use the term baby boomers. They
Okay.
haven't been babies in a really long time. And the other part of it is Strauss and Howe's term is the boom generation. That's the
The
term that
boom.
they
Yeah.
the actual
Okay.
formal name that they use in their books, nobody calls them the boom generation. They're boomers.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah,
split
you got to kind of
right
meet in
down
the
the middle.
middle at some point.
Yep.
Yeah.
And Gen X are Xers, again followed by Millennials and the whether you call them Homelanders, whether you call them Gen Z.
Go
But
ahead.
basically there are these four archetypes, and the kind of archetype that boomers are. This is the shortest
Mhm.
simplified version I can give. The kind of archetype boomers are is the prophet,
Mhm.
and they're born during eras like the 1950s or the post
Yep.
World War II high, which I mentioned before. The next archetype is the nomad. That's who Gen Xers are. They're
Mhm.
born during second turnings, which, as I said, I call awakenings, and they're the most underprotected kids of any of the four archetypes, which explains a lot about how they grow up and what their personality is as they get older. And it's also why they get left out of a lot of the generations conversations now, is because they're
They
so
kind of like it
criticized.
like that in a way, though. They like it that way.
And a quick aside on that too. Quick aside on that too. I've wondered for a long time why it is when the mainstream media puts up graphics that they put together, before they're introducing some generational poll or study. I've seen a number of instances where Gen Xers don't get mentioned at all. And I think to myself, isn't the person who's behind this whole production an Xer? It's probably not somebody my age. And most of
They
my
want to
parents'
be
generation
left
is
out.
retired.
I really feel
Yeah,
like they want to be left out of it because
I think they do.
anything that's like that, like a big societal thing, we're all getting to get like Gen X isn't like that. They're like, I'm off over here, you do
Yep.
that. Like
Yeah.
I'm
Don't
doing
tread
my
on me.
art, I'm doing my own thing, I'm doing my music, like I'm on my own thing.
Yep.
So yeah, I think they almost kind of like it like that. So it is almost very Gen X to be
Yep.
left out
Yep.
of that kind of stuff.
So we got the prophet
Yeah, yeah,
is boomers, nomad is Xers, millennials are the hero archetype. Now, a
yep.
lot of people snicker at that label. What's
I know, but they
important?
take it literally. I mean,
They take it
yeah.
literally. They
Yeah,
shouldn't. They shouldn't take it too literally. What's
right.
important about that label is it reflects a mindset. It reflects an outlook. It simply reflects when people are born and what kind of orientation to life
Yeah.
and to community and to institutions and to individual ambition they have throughout their lives based upon when they're born, how they're raised, and when
Yeah.
they come of age. And
And
just
yeah.
a quick example on, as I mentioned before, that it's my firm belief that people born in the early 2000s are millennials. As soon as I saw the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas kids in 2018 and organize with help from many other people to be sure, but organize the March for Our Lives and all those sorts of things, I immediately recognized them as people who were similar to people I knew in high school and college, but were just more stridently political, more moving as a
Yeah.
herd. But they had a similar characteristic personality, I thought,
Yeah.
completely independent of the Strauss-Howe stuff, which again was just another illustration of
Right.
generations aren't 16 years long; they're 20 odd years long. These are some of the youngest millennials. They're not Zoomers.
Right. Right.
So we got the prophet, the nomad, the hero, and the last archetype is the artist. And the generations that Heidi's been discussing here, both the silent and today's kids who are up to age 18, they're artist archetypes. These are the children born during crisis eras, what Strauss and Howe also call fourth turning eras.
Yeah.
And because they are at the age they are now, speaking specifically of if you want to call them Gen Z, okay, or Homelanders, whatever. But because they are today more characteristically sensitive, docile, but also much more creative, I think, on the
Hmm.
whole, than millennials, much more empathic. Um, that those are personality traits that are going to be with them for life. They're not simply going to go away just because they go to college, because eras change. They're going to evolve as people, but their basic characteristics, as is true for every generation, are created and crafted and conditioned early in life by their early in life experiences, and they just continue in more or less the same form.
Right. Right. And I think where a generation is in the turnings is also important with these labels too, because when you talk about millennials being the hero, well, when are we going to be in our, 43 to 63, for
Mm,
65 time period? That's going to be during, either war or the first turning, period. Like it's during that period of transition when we are in most positions of power, we'll be in government. The silent generation is going to die like very soon, and it's going to be mostly millennials in government from that whole time period. So that's really what makes us kind of the heroes in that way is that we haven't gotten there yet. So like
Mhm.
you might not think that we are yet because we haven't really gotten to like what defines it. Because like where we are when we experience all of these turnings is also important to like the archetype as well and like how they labeled it. I think like historically being like, okay, these
Yeah.
these were the people that were the heroes, like because they're at this time period in power as well.
And for what it's worth, we don't know. Nobody knows, no matter how
No.
deep you dive into the stuff, nobody knows what the future is going to bring for opportunities for um, millennials to sort of, for our generation to wrest the torch away from the people taking the country and
Yeah, but just looking
unpleasant
at age
directions.
groups, I mean,
Right.
just looking at like obviously those people when you're in that from 40 to 60, even, outside of Strauss and Howe, those people have the most power in societies because that's like you're still young enough, and you're really working and pushing, but you're old enough to be the leaders
Mm.
in the field. And so yeah, so clearly like you're gonna have that, even, you have the silent generation who is still around. I mean, due to entrenched institutions. And so I think that millennials, just based on the way they are, like you mentioned, how politically active and aware, at least, that they are, their sense of wanting justice in some way, that kind of
Civic
leads you
transformation.
to, yeah, that leads you towards, these types of positions, I think. So we're
Yep.
seeing it already. I mean, I think AOC probably quintessential, hero archetype millennial in politics. So I think more of that will become clear.
When she first became a major public figure, did you take stock of who she was or who she presented herself as and think, I've known people exactly like her? Because I know I
I
did.
felt very connected to her. I felt like, even and I feel different now with more perspective, but I think like I felt such a connection to her and her story, like a lot of millennials did, and it was so inspiring. And you'll still hear people in politics talk about, well, I could be the AOC of this group, or I could be the AOC of that group, or I could be like, and like you still kind of use that term. I mean, a little bit less now that she's been around more, but just that tale of the hero, right? That
Yep.
tale of like someone, rising above and beating the man and the system and doing the right thing. Like that's a very millennial inspiring kind of tale of like, like so yeah, like even if you don't whatever you think about her, if you're a millennial, you felt something. You
Oh yeah.
felt something
Oh,
about that. Yeah.
and uh, I wish I could remember her name. The woman who was in the news last year when the Department of Homeland Security had that new department for disinformation or misinformation. I was like, I've
Oh.
known people exactly like her, and there's both
Oh
that.
yeah.
Depending upon how you see politics, and everybody shakes down differently on
Yeah.
how they see people like that. But I had the reaction of, I know people exactly like her. I feel like I have a pretty good sense of what motivates them. They have some good qualities, but they have some qualities that run the
Mm-hmm.
other way too. And they seem not to be aware that they have both those things inside them. They're just very confident. They're just very assured that they know what's right for everybody in
Yep.
a sort of a civic
Yep.
political sense. And
Yep.
that can make
That's
them
yeah.
people to be
That's a
wary of
millennial.
sometimes.
And I mean, it doesn't matter if it's on the left or the right or the center. I mean, you can notice that. If it's a
Yep.
millennial that's coming into leadership, it's really obvious. Like
Mm-hmm.
you're like, yes, I relate to that person. I see what they're doing. Yeah, like, that's the way that I would put it too. You have certain messaging. It's kind of populist. It's sort of like, appealing to that. Like, and I think that, I think, yeah, political figures do play to the generations. We haven't really talked about that, but like marketing and, political messaging and definitely, I think, plays to the largest voting blocks.
Mm-hmm.
And for good reason, obviously. I mean, it's all marketing. You're trying to reach that. So I think millennials are coming into this interesting time where, yeah, it's starting to appeal more to us, as a larger influence in voting block, as opposed to like, boomers have been and still are for a while, but we're kind of coming more into that. So I think we're going to see more very familiar figures, when before you couldn't really relate to a lot of these people in power. And we don't really relate. I don't personally relate to the silent generation that's in power. We're just getting really sick of them. We're just like, like, time for you guys to shut up. Like, all right, that's enough.
And what's funny that you mentioned about them is that reminds me of two predictions, both of which Strauss and Howe got wrong, but one of which, because they've got many
Mhm.
predictions wrong, and maybe
Oh
this
yeah,
will
sure.
dovetail
Yeah.
into where we can lead the conversation next, which is our critiques of the theory.
Yeah.
But regarding the silent generation, they did not see whatsoever that the silent would still be in power now. I don't think anybody saw, especially after Obama came in, and he seemed like such a complete transformational departure from what came before and who came before, that I do think, I won't speak for you, I won't
Yeah.
speak for anybody else. I do sense a lot of millennials felt he really was bringing change, as
Yeah.
the
Well, it was
marketing
the
about him said.
yeah, it was the era changed. You knew
Yeah,
that something was changing. You knew
yeah.
that the era was turning. You knew that, whether you thought good or bad, yeah, you knew that something was up. I think that everybody felt that. Yeah.
But the other prediction that that Strauss and Howe made about the silent generation, which, I mean, it's an anecdotal thing, but it tells you that they were really unafraid to think outside the box, and as you were saying before, using pattern recognition to just
Yeah.
go. I think we see something here,
Yeah.
is that they were writing in the very early 1990s when Bush 41 was in
Hmm.
office. The silent generation might become the first generation in American history never to send one of their own to the White House. They were saying
Wow.
it then because they were looking at the past and saying, by a certain age,
Hmm.
generations of people tend to take the reins of power, not just in terms of representation across every elected branch of government, but the White House too. And when Michael Dukakis lost to George H.W. Bush, they said they might have missed their turn, and if boomers come in next,
Hmm.
they'll probably never get in. Now we have an 80-year-old president now.
Wait, is Trump silent too, or is he boomer?
Trump's a boomer,
Trump's boomer, yeah.
but
So just
Biden
Biden? Is he the only one?
Biden's the only one, and he was
Wow.
born November 20th, 42, which means he was born about 41 days before the first boomers.
Yeah,
He's
I
one of
mean,
the very last. And so he
he's probably like
snuck
the
in
least inspiring, like
at the at the
president ever. So
last
like,
at the last possible
yeah,
instant that somebody his age could have won the seat. He won a first term in the seat. He did. I mean, it would have been impossible afterwards.
really
And again,
weird.
I won't get
Yeah,
into the election
really.
or any of that.
Yeah,
But
I know. But I mean, you can
uh,
have your own theories on that. But yeah, I
yes,
mean, it definitely seems forced. He's not an inspiring figure. I think anybody, can agree with that. He's not like, he's not an Obama figure. Nobody was like, oh my God, like that wasn't happening. It was just like, it was very reactionary
yeah,
and very like just a return to normalcy, like no malarkey,
yeah,
like what is that about? That's like
yeah.
not relatable to most people. But if you think about the silent generation, yeah, it's just like,
Mhm.
let's just turn to status quo for a minute and just like things
Yeah.
are getting out of hand. And I mean, I don't know if he'll have a second term, but I think, I don't know, it could be doubtful. But yeah, very very interesting. I wouldn't expect silent generation to be president, and I'm very shocked that you still have, I think, Pelosi's silent generation too. Like all these
Mhm,
all these
mhm.
leaders are, silent generation and on
Yeah,
their way out. Hmm.
yeah. Bernie Sanders, Pat Leahy, Mitch McConnell,
Wow, yeah, so many.
Jim Clyburn, Anthony Fauci is.
Oh God. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
time. But I mean, who's gonna take up the torch? I mean, that's why it's like I think millennials are at that point of
Who
wanting to take up a torch.
what I think is clear is that when the pendulum swings to, and it could not even be a millennial, but it could be just a younger Xer,
Yeah.
whomever that is. Ron DeSantis, for whatever what it's worth,
Like an ex president.
is
Yeah, I like a
I think he's
generation.
only 45. People think he's older, but he's not
He's
that
Gen
much older
X.
than you and I. He's an Xer, but
Yeah.
he's one of the youngest governors in the country. And and he's making a serious run for it now.
Yeah.
That when that pendulum shifts to the younger politician demo, it's going to shift. It's going to swing hard, and it's
Mm.
going to stay with millennials.
A long time, I
It's
think.
not
Yeah.
inconceivable.
Yeah.
It's not inconceivable that once millennials take the presidency, they could have it for the rest of our natural.
Hmm.
There could be a millennial born in the year 2000 who's president in 2064. It's
Oh
not
yeah.
inconceivable
Oh
because
yeah.
that's what typically happens with those kinds of generations, our kind of generation.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's gonna be quite the long reign. So
Yep.
we'll see what we do with it. I don't know. But yeah, we'll see what happens.
So to start to wind down a little bit,
Yeah.
so again, Neil's next book is coming out next week. I know a lot of
Yeah.
people, especially in the
I
alternate media
didn't
space.
actually name my article to be the same as his book either.
Yeah,
I didn't know
yeah,
that, but yeah,
yeah.
it's funny.
A lot of people in the alternate media space will be reviewing it, will be critiquing it. I think I'll critique the book more than most people who are familiar with his prior work
Right.
do, and it's not out of a lack of admiration and appreciation. It's just I have, and I can tell by how long we've talked about this that you do too. I have so many ideas about specific things that I just don't know if people older than millennials really appreciate about who we are and about our contributions to where the country is going and what the possibilities are. That I
Yeah.
think
We'll see.
there will be gaps in his book that should be addressed by other people who understand the ideas.
I agree. I mean, he did recently come on with Tony Robbins. Did you see that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And so that was interesting to me that he was like, bringing this into, I don't know, the personal development space almost, or like this, this self-help kind of motivational. And they're bringing him on for that. And so I'm like, interesting. I mean, I agree though. I mean, I think we need younger people to start studying this. Hopefully you have a book in mind that would, I mean, somebody's got to
Someday.
carry the torch. Somebody has to carry the torch. I'll
Yeah.
continue to write a little articles here and there, blurbs, but and have these conversations, I think is really important. But yeah, I mean, I'm very interested to read it and see, what his perspective is on where we're at and, what patterns, he's seeing. So it's, yeah, I mean, hopefully he does go a little further than just the fourth turning. I mean, 'cause that's a little odd to me. It's just like the
Yeah.
fourth turning and then the fourth turning is here. I mean, hopefully, I would think it'd be first turning. Honestly, that's what
Yeah.
I would have guessed, like,
Mhm.
like the
Yeah.
name of the book. But
A little
I
more
get it. I
hopeful it would
mean,
be.
I get it. You want to sell books. You're going to sell a lot more books with the fourth turning since it's become, somewhat well-known phrase and
Mm.
used mostly incorrectly, but still used than you would
Yes.
with first turning. No one would know what the hell that is, which is the
Yeah.
hilarious part. So yeah, very interesting. But
Yeah.
yeah, we can talk about a little bit of critiques if you want, or where did you
Yeah. Oh,
want
yeah.
to go?
I'm very interested to hear yours.
Yeah, I think I mentioned some of them. I mean, one of my critiques would be that they don't account. I don't think that they account for the generation that raised you as much as I would like to see. I mean, they do a bit, but I think that the problem is that, and I hope maybe he covers this, but when you have grandparents and other people raising a generation, I think that there's an impact there that should be discussed. So I think that that's one critique I have. Another critique would be the cusp issue that I think could be delved into deeper. And um, yeah, I do think that there's it's not a generation, but there's an interesting personality of people on the cusps that should be discussed and kind of appreciated a bit more. So I guess it's a minor critique. Just I would like to hear more about it. I guess it's like one of my main critiques is they just didn't write enough. Like they did, but I think that they didn't make it as accessible enough as a
Mhm.
theory for the average person. I mean, one, the body of work is too small. Two, they didn't make it as contemporary. It was a bit like academic, and you have to be kind of a geek to like want to geek out on it and really think about it. And then they allowed, I think, the press and pop culture to define these terms without stepping in enough to be like, wait a minute, like because I would be like jumping in and trying to get on like CNN and talk about these things when they're like getting it all wrong. I feel like they kind of stepped back and stepped
Mhm.
away and we're just like whatever. do your thing.
Hmm.
Like
Yep.
society, like we,
Yep.
like, as academics tend to do, and writers tend to do. So, we don't always want to defend our work and our writing every day, as a writer. So I get that. But I think they could have been, more in the conversation. And I think obviously, like, it's not I think that people make it like an overarching theory that just defines like a person completely. And I think that's not necessarily a critique on them, because I think they clearly don't see it that way and realize humans have many other characteristics and traits. So I think it's more of just a critique of how people view the theory. But yeah, I mean, I think that yeah, my critiques are really, yeah, that I just wanted to hear more from them and have it more accessible, because all I have is a few articles and Generations and the Fourth Turning, and some other things. But yeah, I wanted a larger body of work when I started getting into it. It's sort
Yeah.
of like finding a show that you really like and there's only one season.
Yeah. Or like the
Yeah,
Chappelle show. It's two seasons and
yeah,
then
right. The Freaks
this
and
is one
Geeks
with
is one of
Biden.
my favorites. It's a very Gen X show if you haven't
Yep.
seen it. But yeah, like that's another one where there's only one season. And you're just like, but what happens? So yeah, so I would like to see that. Yeah, I think that's the main ones I have, but I'm interested in your critique.
Well, my basic critique, and it seems this is an obvious thing to say, but the world is complex, life is complex, generations are complex, and I think this is kind of actually what my last episode was about. Was that I think there just is an inherent advantage to being a millennial, understanding these ideas, because
Hmm.
so many of the people who have used the basic understanding of these ideas to predict the future have done it on the basis of seeing millennials as almost like blocks of wood, where we have this very strident, achievement oriented, frankly, collectivist orientation as a group. There's a lot of variation
Yeah,
amongst us, but we're oriented toward politics more than culture. We're oriented
yeah,
toward achievement more than spirituality. All those things. They take all these qualities lots of the time and just project that forward into the future as though maybe this is the way it's usually presented. The future might not be great, but hey, if millennials do their job, everything will be fine. I think there's a part of them that does think, and lots of these kinds of people have millennial children too, so that's important to know too. It's not
yeah,
they're completely
yeah,
separate
yeah,
businesses, but they also are using a framework, using a set of ideas developed a long time ago, and sort of still assuming that we're either the kids that we were when the theory was developed, or we're characters out of some future Tom Brokaw book that's going to profile all the great things we did if things work out well. And I think,
yeah. Self-fulfilling prophecy almost.
yeah, we are a group of people that has strengths and weaknesses. And given the state of things in the country now, it's not necessarily a guarantee, even if we apply ourselves in all the right ways. It's not necessarily a guarantee that we'll bring out the outcomes that the people who have cast or invested the most hope in us want to see.
Right. Well, isn't it? I mean, can it go one or two ways? Like it can go like there's this event, this secular event, which they call it Generations, and then it can go positive, or it can be more reactionary. Does
Mm-hmm.
that make sense?
Yes.
Like, yeah, so I think it's always gone, or maybe almost always gone the positive way, which is why they predict that, because that's the common theme, but it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have to. I mean, you could have a reactive response and have like a different experience of that, and that's something we don't know about, but it could like it could go a different direction too that we don't know of. And I think they did try to cover that. I mean, maybe you know a bit more about that. Do you know what I'm talking about? The
Well,
reaction to
Neil
that
has
event.
Neil has. I hope this answers your question.
Yeah.
Neil has commented on a few items going on that mostly involve people our age and younger, that he's either keeping an eye on or that concern him or that give him hope or whatever it is. But there are certain things like for example, what's happening in the world of the central banks and with everything going on in cryptocurrency. I think that there are aspects of that movement that I wish he would have more to say about. College campuses is definitely a big one too. Speaking specifically as an older millennial here, I when I saw the woke movement on campuses start to really spring up a few years after I completed my fancy degree from a school on the East Coast, I said to myself, I wonder if I should have seen this coming. I thought, in looking back on my own experiences on campus and around people my age and a bit younger than me, that strain of having a conventional outlook, absorbing all the ideas that are specific to the modern college campus, and moving as a group in response to things happening in the outside world, I thought to myself, had something like the events going on now happen when I was 20 or 25, something like this could have happened then. So events do play a role. Events can take a dangerous turn. Bad ideas can have a big influence in how things happen in an unexpected way. What's important though is that whether you're one of the older millennials like you and I, or you're somebody in the middle, or you're somebody near the tail end who's just on a college campus now, or in the economy working your first jobs now, we all belong to a generation that is more oriented toward politics and achievement and civic progress than inner values, inner spirituality, and the rest. And we move among peers who are moving the needle politically and culturally a certain way. And it's not necessarily guaranteed it's going to be as wholesome as some of the predictions that were made a long time ago
Yeah.
expected.
Yeah, no, I would agree there. I mean, we don't know. I mean, modern world is also so much different than the world has been when these theories were come up with. The acceleration of technology, that's a potential critique. It's not really fully accounted for yet, at least like how, the acceleration of authoritarianism, the post 9/11 world, so many different things, globalization. So also like we were not as globalized, when a lot of this was, come up with. Now we're quite globalized, I think, and we have, this like more global mindset, where the actions of another country affect us and vice versa. And we have the strong influence of China and, the pending possible war with Russia. You don't know all these
Mm-hmm.
things that could potentially come up, which in a way makes sense with the theory because something's going to happen at some point. But what's the reaction going to be, and what's the millennial role going to be in that? And heroes can be anti-heroes. I mean,
Yep.
a hero doesn't mean like we do good things necessarily. It just means that we're doing things. I mean,
Yep.
so
I
we'll
mean,
find out. Yeah.
is that we move the lever
Hmm.
one way and in a big way and as a group, and
Yeah.
once the lever starts moving, it's hard to move it back.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And a high can go different ways. Highs can also be dark, like highs don't have to be positive, but you can feel optimistic about it, and that could be very dark. You could have something like like a Nazi Germany or something could be considered a high in certain ways. Like you have like this economic boom and but then it leads to like dark places. So I mean that kind of thing can happen too. Just because it's a high doesn't mean it's a good time necessarily, and not for everybody, certainly. So yeah, there's so many different things, and yeah, I'm super interested to dig into what he put together, and I hope that he was contemporary enough, and did talk more about the millennials, and what we've been through now that we're coming into adulthood, and and really our peak time of power essentially is coming up here. So what's going to happen? But yeah, we'll see. Yeah, we should talk again after I read it, maybe, and dig into it a bit and see what we thought. Maybe do a critique.
Absolutely. Well, we are almost at the 2 hour mark. This has been quite a conversation.
Yeah, I think we covered a lot. I can still keep
We
going, but
did.
yeah, I should
Yeah.
go. But it's been lovely and so interesting, and I hope that this inspires, people to think about these issues and write your own content. Like I said, there's a content deficit, I think, around generational theory. So,
Yep.
do what Paul's doing and make videos or content if you have any aspect that's interesting to you. I'd love to see it, and please do let me know.
All right. Well, once again, Heidi, thank you for your time. Neil
Sure.
Howe's next book, The Fourth Turning, is here. Hits stores, hits Amazon, hits every place that sells books. Tuesday of next week, the 18th, and a lot of people will be talking about. A lot of people will be reading it. I expect that most of the reviews and conversation about it will be in the alternate media, but we shall see. At any rate, it's going to be a conversation mover, and hopefully we can have a conversation again down the road.
Yeah,
Thank you
love
for your
that.
time, and thank you for being the first guest in the history of
Number one.
Generation. Thank you.
I love it. Well, I'm an older millennial, so it makes sense. 1983. This should be your first guest,
All
right?
right.
All right.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks again. Have a good one.
Bye.